Thank you so much, and I really do appreciate you taking your time to come here and see what we do. But we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we operate under the name of Dorchester Children's Center. And our 501c3 name is actually Children in Crisis in Dorchester County. But I think when they started forming this organization years ago in like 1997, is actually when they started doing it, they didn't really realize that that name would not be well on the door. So we do operate under as Dorchester Children's Center. So we are a children's advocacy center, and children's advocacy centers came about in about the mid-1980s when child advocates started to realize that we were re-victimizing these children when they came to the attention of the system. And that usually was as a result of sexual abuse. And when the children came to the attention of the system, it was usually by telling someone they trusted, and many, many times that was a teacher. And if they told that teacher that someone was inappropriately touching them, then as you can imagine, that teacher back in the mid-1980s would not have a clue what to do. And there weren't really many protocols for that in the school system in general. So what would happen is that that teacher would then have to go to the guidance counselor, the principal, that hierarchy of the school, and then find out what to do. Well, those people would probably want to talk to the child as well to make sure before we call law enforcement and Child Protective Services and create a problem for this family that we know what we're talking about and that it's legitimate. So they would talk to the child too. So now the child's talked to 3 or 4 people in the school district. Then you get the first responders coming in from law enforcement and Child Protective Services. Well, those would be the road deputies maybe from law enforcement. That wouldn't be the detective handling the case, and it wouldn't be the caseworker handling the case from Child Protective Services. So that child would then have to tell several more people what was going on. If it was going to be prosecuted, then they would have to talk to the solicitor's office as well. So it wasn't unusual for these children to talk to 10 to 15 people about what was going on in their lives. And so as you can imagine, and I always ask this question, if you can imagine as an adult, if you were sexually assaulted and you had to go tell law enforcement so that your offender could be held accountable and prosecuted, you would have to tell in graphic detail what happened so that they could go and find corroborating evidence, because just your word against that person's word. So you would have to do that. That would be pretty uncomfortable. But we asked 5-year-olds to do that. We asked 10-year-olds to do that. We asked 15-year-olds to do that because they have to, because we cannot hold the offender accountable and we cannot provide them with the treatment they need if we do not know what has happened to them. So that's what we do. So these advocates said, okay, let's bring all of these players to the table, the law enforcement, Child Protective Services, medical people, to get the medical exams, and prosecution and mental health, and the CAC, the victims advocates in the CAC. Those are the core group of people who work together in the investigation and prosecution of these cases. And that's the core group you have to have, or you cannot be an accredited CAC. We are a nationally accredited CAC by the National Children's Alliance in Washington, D.C. But without that core group of people, if they refuse to come to the table and work these cases with us, we would not be able to be accredited and we would not have a children's advocacy center. That is the tenet of it. Now we bring in also the school professionals and the Department of Juvenile Justice as well in our group, as well as many, many other agencies that we bring to the table in here when we staff these cases, but they're not a core group. They don't have to be there to be for our accreditation, but those 5 do. So our mission is to provide that coordinated, evidence-based response to child abuse in that investigative piece to reduce the trauma for the child and the family. And that's just crucial that you understand that. If you walk away not remembering anything else, remember that the main thing we're going to want to do is reduce the trauma to the child during that investigative piece and to the family as well. So prior to our existence, and we were founded, or actually we were founded in 1997, I believe, is when the actual group came together, but we didn't start services until December of 2003. And in that first 13-month period of 2003 and all of 2004, we saw, I think, 57 children that year. The next year, when we were fully operational and were able to hire staff, we saw 441 children that next year. That's how bad the need was, and nobody even knew we were here too much. So then it has grown every single year. Last year, we saw 1,208 kids in the center last year. But there were no services in our community, so only the most horrendous cases would be seen because they would go to the Children's Advocacy Center downtown Charleston. There are 17 Children's Advocacy Centers in the state of South Carolina and over 750 in the United States. So some of the tenets of a Children's Advocacy Center that I think you probably saw as you come through were that we videotape all of our forensic interviews. We want law enforcement and Child Protective Services, if they're involved in the case, because not always are they both involved, we want them across the room in that other room observing. Because if they have questions, follow-up questions they want us to ask, we want them to be able to do that at that time. We do not want to have to bring that child back for a follow-up interview if we don't have to. And so law enforcement's looking for evidence. So if a child talks about the abuse and the abuse scenario, and they're talking about the incident in graphic detail, and they're telling all of these things, well, if there was, for example, a product used, then the detective's going to want to know where that, and we're trained to do that as well, so they want to know where that product was, where the offender got the product. So if they say, well, they got it from a nightstand beside the bed, well, if the detective goes to get a warrant and leaves here and goes to the house and finds that product in the bedside table, right by the bed, just where the child said it, that corroborates the child's story. So law enforcement looking for those type of things so that they can, when they get the warrant, they go to the search, then they can go do that. If they find out that they've been videoed by a cell phone, they can get the cell phone and they can go and search the cell phone for evidence as well. So that's what they're looking for. Child Protective Services is looking for safety in the home. If the child's safe in the home, if there's not an issue as far as the child's safety in the home, they're not going to be involved. So, but they're going to want to know all of those things. And when we get an allegation in here of, say, sexual abuse, we're still going to ask other things. Who feeds you? Who takes you to the doctor? Who gives you kisses? Who, what do you get for dinner at night? What happens when you get hurt? Just those things we're going to find out, because we want to know if there's any neglect going on or any physical abuse. What happens when you get into trouble? How do you get punished? So who punishes you, and how does that happen? So we also provide a lot of family support services here and evidence-based therapy. There's no therapy we do here that is not proven to work by research in this population of people, because we don't want to use these children as guinea pigs. We want to make sure that we're using trauma treatment if there has been a trauma incident. And it's a child-friendly environment. I think you can see that as you walk through. It's very child-friendly, very warm, and that's purposeful. We made sure that was done when we moved in. The forensic medical exams, you have to offer those. The Medical University of South Carolina places that program here free of charge. We've never paid a dime for it. The only thing we do is provide them space. And I can't thank the Medical University enough for that they care enough about these kids to bring that program from downtown Charleston to Summerville. And then we do a lot of prevention programs, coordination with community services, court advocacy. If the case does go to court, then we will work with the child to lessen the trauma in that courtroom experience. So we'll do that as well. Most of these cases do not go to court, so that's usually not a big issue, but when they do, then we can be there for the child and the family as well. We do a lot of consultation and training for other professionals in the realm of child abuse, and then we do our multidisciplinary team case reviews every week. So we're here, Dorchester County and then Berkeley County the next week. So we're in this room with all of those professionals sitting around the table. Law enforcement is talking about what they found in their investigation. Child Protective Services is saying what they found in their investigation. We're talking about what we found in the forensic interview. The Medical University is saying this is what I found in the medical exam. Guardian ad litem is saying this is what I found when I talked to the family and the children. The school district's there saying this is where the child's grades are. This is any behavioral changes. This is what their demeanor's like. This is what the interaction with the parents have been like, or the caregivers. So as you can imagine, that when we finish going through all of those people talking about this particular child and family, we have a pretty good picture of what's going on in that child's life from every aspect. So you can make better recommendations at that point in time for the child and family when you have the whole piece or whole pie rather than just a piece of the pie. So we're happy about that. And the last thing I want you to remember about us is that we're neutral. We're not here to dogmatically find child abuse. That's not what we're here for. We're hoping that this child has not had a traumatic experience. But what we're here for is to find out what the child has experienced, period. Because then we can work forward from that. But we're not here to blame anybody for anything and cause a family problems when nothing has happened, because that would not do anybody any good, and especially the child. So there was a research study done at the University of New Hampshire a couple of years ago that found that when the Children's Advocacy Center was involved, rather than fragmented services of law enforcement, child protective services, and everybody doing their own investigation without coming together, they found that the children were twice as likely to get a medical exam. And that's pretty explainable, because the process of disclosure for kids is again, it is a process. If a child trusts you enough to tell you that somebody's inappropriately touching them, then they're gonna do that in a process. they're not going to just spill everything out to you in the beginning because they don't know how you're going to react. So if a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old is being inappropriately touched, then if they go to a teacher and they trust that teacher enough to talk to them, what are they going to do? They're going to say something minor and benign in the beginning. And then if that teacher doesn't act horrified and shocked or appalled or embarrass the child, then the child might trust him to tell them a little bit more. And then as the time goes on, they might tell them a little bit more and a little bit more. But it really does depend on what reaction they get, because they're going to test the water in the beginning. So disclosure is a big process. And even in families, they may not tell you everything that happened to them ever, because it's just too difficult for them to do that. So we know that if they tell a first responder that they were touched inappropriately, they may only say they were touched over the clothes, when in fact it may have been full-on penetration with a sexual act. So we know that. So they need a medical exam. We know they need a medical exam, and for nothing else, they need it just to reassure themselves that their bodies are okay. So, because that is definitely something they're going to be concerned about. So they also found that the child and the family were 3 times more likely to get a mental health referral, and again, for the same reasons. Law enforcement's looking for evidence to prosecute a case, an arrest. Child Protective Services is looking for safety in the home. Not everybody is focused on the child's future and making sure that that child's getting the mental health that they need. So that's important as well. They also found that better criminal justice outcomes came because of law enforcement involvement with the Children's Advocacy Center, as well as greater levels of satisfaction for the reduction in trauma to the child and the family. And we saved the community about $1,000 per services because they're not fragmented, because everybody's working together on the same cases. So the types of abuse we see here, are physical, sexual, neglect, emotional abuse, drug endangerment, witness to domestic violence, and then of course safety precaution. Because if one child has been inappropriately touched in the family where someone has had access to all the children, then we definitely want to talk to that child as well, because maybe the child just hasn't felt comfortable in telling. We also know that child abuse, there's 3 times more abuse that goes on than ever gets reported to the system. So we know that most children do not tell, period. So we only get a small amount of them. And both males and females are perpetrators of child abuse, but just certainly more males are perpetrators of sexual abuse than females, although we have had female perpetrators of sexual abuse in here as well. So some statistics that I won't bore you with a lot of them, but over 4 children do die every day in the United States as a result of child abuse. And over 80% of those children are going to be under the age of 4. And I think that that's, again, pretty self-explanatory, because the younger the child is, the easier they are to hurt. And the #1 cause of infant death in child abuse cases is abusive head trauma. And that's because the child was hit or slammed, or the head was hit, or they're thrown against a wall or something like that. Or shaken baby syndrome. I'm sure everybody's heard of that. And that's abusive head trauma. Most of the child abuse does go unreported again. And that about 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. And again, over 90% of these kids are going to know, love, and trust the person who abused them. And again, that's self-explanatory. If somebody has a proclivity to have sex with a child, if they're interested in children for sexual purposes, they've got to gain access to that child in some way, shape, or form. So that means they have to gain the child's trust. They have to gain the family's trust in many instances. And then in many, many cases, they have to gain the trust of the institution they work for or they volunteer with. And we see that in the paper all the time. But that's the reason. If you want to get near a child, you have to have access in some way, shape, or form. You have to gain that access. So abuse does cross all ages, races, religions, socioeconomic levels. Nobody is immune. Anybody's child can be in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. And that's why we as adults have to protect our kids and make sure that we're putting safeguards in with our children so that there's never an opportunity for somebody to gain access to our child one-on-one with an adult. So the effects, of course, are death, as we just talked about, physical injuries, and possible cognitive problems with brain damage. And again, if shaken baby syndrome, if that happens and they don't kill the child, then a lot of times you're going to have definitely brain damage from the child. And then if those physical injuries are able to heal, then you'll almost always have the psychological effects that linger, the low self-esteem, depression, PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. And then just difficulty in bonding and forming relationships. As you can imagine, that if that's somebody the child knew, love, and trust, and they betrayed that trust like that, then can you imagine when they're forming new relationships, they're always going to wonder if they're going to betray that relationship as well. So it's very difficult for them. Developmental delays and learning disabilities are highly correlated with child abuse, as well as behavior disorders and aggression. And again, that's self-explanatory, because if, again, something happened to one of you, you're an adult, you could clearly articulate what was going on with you emotionally and psychologically. So you could tell your friend or your therapist or your spouse, somebody, this is the way I feel, and my feelings are just running the gamut, and sometimes I'm sad, and sometimes I'm shameful, and sometimes I'm euphoric that I survived, and blah, blah, blah. And you could do that. But kids are not developmentally able to do that. So the way a child is going to tell you that something is wrong with them or something's wrong in their life is usually through their behavior. And it may be behavior disorders and aggression, or it may be depression, and maybe take it inwards. So, but their behavior typically will tell you what's going on with them, or that something's going on with them. And then also, long-term child abuse can affect low academic performance, as well as repeating the cycle of abuse. Not everybody who was abused as a child is going to repeat that cycle of abuse, but they are more likely to. I think it's 6 or 7 times more likely to. Juvenile delinquency and adult criminal behavior are highly correlated because of, you think about a child who's coping with this and never received any treatment, then they may turn to drugs or alcohol or sexual promiscuity, may end up pregnant as a teen, suicidal ideation, obesity. Those are all coping mechanisms for a child trying to figure out how to deal with all this bad stuff that's happened to them when they haven't had any proper treatment. So some other statistics are 85% of long-term prisoners were abused as kids. Most kids don't grow up thinking that what I want to do is get in trouble with the law and go to jail. Circumstances bring them to that conclusion. And then adult alcoholism is also highly correlated with child abuse, as well as high school dropouts. And then again, survivors are 6 times more likely to become an abusive parent. So there's a study called the ACEs study. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and it's an extremely interesting study, and it's the longest ongoing study with over 17,000 participants, and I think it began in 1995. And it examined your childhood maltreatment experiences and your adult health and well-being, and how that correlates, and what happened to you as a child, and how you ended up as an adult. And it found that those childhood maltreatment experiences really had a huge effect on your mental health and and physical health. And so chronic health issues and chronic mental health issues are just huge in that. Low educational attainment, juvenile delinquency, cognitive impairments as well, and then just the adult criminality as well. And it is just really a study that is just so interesting. And all you got to do is Google ACEs, A-C-E-S, and it'll come up. But the premise is this, that the child has these adverse childhood experiences. Sometimes there's disrupted neurodevelopment, because if you have those cognitive development issues where you maybe have you have the shaken baby, or you have some cognitive problems with abuse, head injuries, things like that. The other thing that people don't really understand is, just like with neglect, when we talk to babies and we do that baby talk with babies, that's not just for fun. When you're having that interaction with that child, and that child's looking at you and listening to you and responding to you, and you're touching that child, that touch and that interaction is helping to build the brain. It's helping to build those neurons. And if that doesn't happen, if a child's left in the crib all day and never has that interaction, then their brains are not going to develop as well or as fast as a child who's getting good nurturing. So sometimes you get that disrupted neurodevelopment, and then also you'll get those social, emotional, and cognitive impairments because of that abuse and because you're not dealing well with it. And then that is going to lead to adoption of those healthy risk behaviors like smoking, drinking, drugging, things like that. Then that leads to disease, disability, and social problems, and then many, many times early death. And there are indicators on the ACEs study. I think there were 10 questions on the original ACEs study. And the more that you can check off that you were neglected, you were physically abused, you were sexually abused, your parents had a horrific divorce which you were put in the middle of, death of a family member, just different things like that. I can't remember exactly all of them, but the more ACEs you could check off out of 10, the higher problems you were going to have as an adult. So if you haven't, you can take the ACEs, and they have the test online too, but you can take it if you have a score of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but 4 or more had serious problems as well. And then as you can see, that's just the chronic depression one. And as you can see, that women had more problems than men with that. And then this is the underlying suicide attempts with the number of ACEs score that you had as well. You know, we always talk about workforce development and education and all of that stuff. Well, think about that. I mean, if these people are having chronic health issues and chronic mental health issues, then they're going to have more absenteeism, they're going to have more financial problems, they're going to make worse decisions, and then sometimes serious job problems as well. So it affects our community on a large scale. So then the community, again, think about, you know, we talked about the individual costs. Think about those costs to the community, the child welfare system, the law enforcement system, the criminal justice system. All of those things are responding to the issues that we just talked about because we have to have them, and they're full of them. If you go to the courts, you go to the emergency rooms, you go to law enforcement complexes, you're going to see a lot of this type of thing in there because that's what they're there for, to respond to these issues. So I'll tell you a little bit about our center now and how we respond, but most of the kids we see, about 60% of the kids we see are Caucasian and then about 35 African American. The biggest age group we're going to see is that 7 to 12 year age group. That's not indicative of child abuse in general. It probably would be that lower age group, 0 to 6, but remember, we can't do forensic interviews on anybody that's not cognitively able to do that. So 3 years old, iffy, 4s on up is pretty much it. But, and then if they're hurt badly, they're going to the emergency room. They're not coming here. You know, even though we have medical services here, they'll go to the emergency room. So that's the next highest group. And then the teenagers, most of these kids, families have come to the attention of the system before. The system has not helped them, or they have maybe made it worse. And so those kids are not going to come in here and talk to us many times. Many times they're just not interested in being involved in the community systems because they have let them down before. And then many times these young girls think that if they're having a relationship with a 38-year-old guy, that that's love, because they really don't understand that is abuse if they're 13 years old and the guy's 38 years old. So they're not going to tell on him, so they're just not going to come in. So typologies of abuse, this would be 1 year, and the reason that would go over, I think that year we saw about 1,000 children, but that would equate to about 1,300 kids, and the reason for that is because many kids come in with an allegation of more than one type of abuse. It could be neglect or sexual abuse, or it could be physical abuse and sexual abuse, physical abuse and neglect, something like that. So some of the examples of the cases we see, and I always apologize for the slide when I put it up because I don't do it to sensationalize what we do or to shock you or to depress you, but we have to be very careful with our staff. These children come in here and to sit across from a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old and hear about a graphic sexual encounter with an adult is pretty horrifying. And you have to do that with no expression on your face. You know, no, just thankful that, you know, thank you for telling me that, and could you tell me a little bit more, and what happened then? And that's what we have to do, because we're not a therapist at that point in time. We are a person who is just trying to gather the facts of what this child has experienced so that the offender can be prosecuted and that we can get this child help because we know exactly what happened to them. So we have 20 staff members, actually that's 21 staff members. We have a detective here who is designated Crimes Against Children from the Dorchester County Sheriff's Office. And then we have Medical University here who also does are board certified in child abuse pediatrics, and that's a board specialty, by the way. Your pediatrician is not trained in child abuse pediatrics. This is a board certification, and they alternate between pediatric nurse practitioners and physicians, and they alternate through here. We are getting ready to get our second practitioner here. We have 2 medical rooms downstairs, but we've only had 1 practitioner here, and so we're able to get 2 now, so they're in the process of doing that now, but we'll be able to do double the medical exams we're doing here because we're 3 and 4 weeks out on medical exams, because that's how bad it is. And that if it's an emergency, of course, we're going to work them in and they have emergency slots, but if it's not an emergency, then we're backed up. And then we have a huge volunteer and intern program here as well. So our forensic services are, 3 to 17 years old, we're going to do the forensic interview. Our interviewers are all master's level. It requires specialized training and specialized ongoing training as well. Peer supervision, and it's a fact-finding, child-friendly, neutral, and non-leading conversation. So we're taught not to lead the child. It is so easy to ask a leading question. So that's why when we do our trainings with other professionals, like in the school district, we're doing the guidance counselors here tomorrow, we're doing the same type of thing. And what we want to make sure they understand is if a child trusts you enough to tell you something that's happening to them, you got to be careful about your reaction, and do not ask them any questions. Because if you ask them questions, children want to please, typically. So they may tell you something or go along with what you're saying when that's not what happened, or that's not exactly what happened, and that's not going to serve anybody. So we want to make sure that we are not leading the child and that we're asking open-ended questions so that everything that comes out of that child's mouth is what the child experienced, not what they think they want, that we want them to say. They are observed by the MDT investigative members, and it is to determine what happened to the child and document it for the court, and so that the child doesn't have to say it again and go through it again. And then, of course, we do a lot of education during our forensic services about treatment options and just about the dynamics of child abuse and the process of disclosure. We want to make sure, that caregivers know what the symptoms and the behaviors are, and then how to deal with those symptoms and behaviors of trauma. And then just how, if the child wants to disclose further to you, how you should respond and how you should react to that. And just dynamics of child abuse, because people don't understand if a child discloses and then all of a sudden they come back later and say, okay, that wasn't true. I shouldn't have said that, it wasn't happening. That's just normal, because usually when a child discloses, there's disruption in the family, because usually it's a family member, or you got mom crying, or you got grandma crying, or if it was granddad was the abuser, or stepdad, or whomever. Well, think about what that does to the child when they disclose, and then all of this chaos ensues in the family. What happens? The child takes on that shame and blame for it, and then all they want to do is take it back and get the family back to normal. All they really wanted was the abuse to stop. They didn't want dad to go to jail, granddad to go to jail. They love these people. That's the thing that's hard for people to understand, and especially in juries. Well, if this was happening, why didn't that child tell? Well, most kids don't tell. And these are things that are easy to explain if you understand childhood or child abuse dynamics. But if you don't understand it, then people don't believe the child. And the best indicator that something has happened to the child is if the child tells you that, because most of them don't tell. So the Medical University, forensic medical exams, birth to 17 years old. If a child has a lot of bruises and all of that, then and the child has come to the attention of the system several times, they'll do full body x-rays on these children, because they want to see if there's been more fractures or more broken bones that may be healed without being treated. So they're going to do those full body x-rays on them. Again, it's a specialized training, and the purpose of it is to evaluate the child, diagnose and treat and document the abuse, and they'll take pictures and things like that for court, and it's for evidence as well. And then just to reassure that child that their bodies are okay. The treatment referrals, just depending on what the child's needs are and the disclosure, what type of disclosure and all of that, then they're going to refer out to other community agencies or us. Then we do trauma treatment, and the main #1 trauma treatment we do is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and probably all of you have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy before, and that's where you're linking those cognitions or those thoughts to feelings, and then those feelings to behaviors. So if someone's going into a therapist just, for whatever reason, maybe they're just drinking too much, or maybe they're depressed or whatever, then the first thing they're going to talk about are those cognitions, their thoughts, and what their thoughts are about themselves. And if they have negative thoughts about themselves, then those thoughts are going to make them feel bad about themselves and have those bad feelings about themselves. And then they may go to have, drink too much or drink in excess or things like that. Well, the goal is to change those negative thoughts or those negative cognitions to positive cognitions, and the therapist is going to work with that person to do that. And then when they change those, and of course that's going to equate to more positive feelings about themselves and then more positive coping mechanisms. So then they, instead of going home and drinking a bottle of wine, then they may go home and exercise. This is where we are going to ask the child to go back and talk about what happened to them in graphic detail. We're going to take them back step by step by step by step by step. And that's the trauma spin on the cognitive behavioral therapy, because these kids are going to have negative feelings about themselves and negative thoughts and those negative feelings, and then they're going to have negative coping mechanisms. It may be behavior, maybe negative behaviors, maybe depression, whatever it is. So when we do that CBT, then we're going to put that trauma spin on it, because we're going to take them back through that trauma, go through it in graphic detail, because we're going to do that for a lot of reasons. One, we want to desensitize them to what happened to them. So if they come in and they can't even get through the story because they're crying so much, then we want to, at the end of the treatment, we want to make sure that they can tell that story to us, not to anybody, but to us, without having that all that emotion attached to it. Because they'll need to understand whose fault it was, that it wasn't their fault, and that they're going to have more positive feelings about themselves. We also want them to understand the triggers. So again, if a product was used, if there was a television show on every day at that point in time, if there was a particular type of music that was played or a song that was played, anything, if mom went to work at 4 o'clock that afternoon and Andy Griffith's show was on the television, then every time that show comes on, what is that going to do to the child? It's going to bring that child right back to that moment of being sexually abused. Same thing with music, same thing with products, anything, smells, anything that could bring the child back. So what we want to make sure that they understand is what those triggers are, and then how to deal with them when they have them. So when they have those triggers, when that happens and they start getting into that panic attack, then they're taught relaxation breathing. We call it bubble breathing, where we take bubbles and they blow the bubbles out, and they breathe out real slow to blow those bubbles out. That's teaching the children how to do that relaxed breathing. And so they'll learn those skills that they can take with them throughout life, to where they can de-escalate the panic and de-escalate those negative feelings when those triggers do occur, because those triggers are never going away, ever. And even when they grow up to be adults, when they have their first child, that's going to be a trigger for them, because then they feel like they've got to protect that child from what happened to them. And if the child is the same gender they are when they get to that same age, if they were 8 years old when the child abuse started, then when their girl child who's 8 years old gets to be that age, then that's going to be another trigger. So there are a lot of triggers. They're never going to end, but we can teach them to deal with it. And there's a caregiver component to all of this. So the caregiver gets some of the knowledge so that they can help them at home doing some of these things as well. So we also do another shorter term trauma treatment called Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention. And these kids are 7 to 18 years old. It's a briefer trauma treatment. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, as far as keeping them from having to go through full TFCBT. But if not, then maybe it'll lessen the time they stay in TFCBT. But the only time we can do this one is if we can get the child in immediately after the traumatic event or immediately after the disclosure. If we can do that, then we might be able to lessen the length of time they're in TFCBT. And then this is something that I'm hugely excited about, and I can say that 4 or 5 years later since we've implemented the program, but used to, when we would sit around the table and discuss these cases with children having sexual behavior problems, and I don't know that you know this, but there is a lot of this. I think about 40% of childhood sexual abuse is done by an older child. So it's huge. So when your children are going to school with other kids, it's far likely that they're going to school with kids who have some sexual behavior problems. And so when they come to the attention of the system as an adolescent, when they're 13 years old, they can be charged with a crime. Nobody wants them to be charged with a crime, because we can extinguish those behaviors if we can get them in here and we can provide this evidence-based treatment. It's a nationally recognized program. University of Oklahoma developed it. We were trained in it. And this adolescent program is a year-long treatment program here, a year long. But if they successfully complete that program and law enforcement has charged, they hold those charges in abeyance, and when they successfully complete and they have not reoffended, then they can get their records expunged. There's only a 4 to 5% recidivism rate if they complete the program for a year. Now you think about how huge that is, how many victims we're going to save if we can get that child into care and then keep them out of the criminal justice system and keep them out of jail. Because if they don't extinguish the behaviors, they're going to continue to do it, even into adulthood. As a child, they're extinguishable. It's not like an adult pedophilia. It's not what it is. But as they grow older, they're going to end up in jail if they continue to do those things. Now, the school age group, 7 to 12, that's a 4 to 8 month treatment program, and there's only a 2 to 3% recidivism rate in that program. So it's a huge, huge thing that we are saving so many kids and so many victims, potential victims. And then there's preschool group, and I know you're probably saying preschool for sexual behavior problems, but yes, and that's 3 to 6 years old, and that's a 13-week treatment program. But that's not your normal sexual curiosity behaviors in preschoolers. That is when their sexual behaviors are way above their developmental level, and they are not being able to be rediverted. So then they come in here, and then we'll do it. So some of the other treatments are trauma screenings. We do those to see what the level of trauma the child or level of trauma symptoms they're experiencing. Not every child that goes through a traumatic experience is going to have the same level of trauma. Kids are different, just like adults are different. Everybody's personalities are different. Everybody reacts to things differently. So what we want to do on the trauma screenings is do the assessment to find out what level of symptomology they have. So if the score is like 50 when they come in here, then we want to see at the end of that treatment that that score has just de-escalated all the way down to where they're not having very many trauma symptoms and they're able to deal with them when they have them successfully. Then we do a psychoeducational group called Be Safe for 3 to 8 years old, and this is where we teach body safety to young kids, and we also teach them the correct names for body parts, as well as what an okay and what a not okay touch is. And even though it's our job as adults to protect kids from childhood sexual abuse, they need to be armed with information that is correct, because we have too many adults who have abused kids tell them this is okay, this is what happens, but it's our secret, and we need them to be armed with correct information to know if this happens to you, that is not okay. This is a not okay touch, and who are some safe people that you can tell if that happens, because then you may be able to prevent a very bad situation. And then abuse and protection clarification, this is where we work with the parents to clarify that whose fault the abuse was, and this can be the offender on neglect or physical abuse cases, but not horrific physical abuse and not sexual abuse. It has to be with the lighter cases where the parent clarifies their responsibility to the child, either in the abuse or that they didn't protect the child. So say a step-parent sexually abused the child, then mom would need to do the clarification to clarify to the child whose fault it was, that it was the offender's fault, but it was their responsibility, the mom's responsibility, to protect the child and not put the child in that situation, and what measures they're going to take next time, which takes the shame and blame off of the child and is hugely, hugely healing for them. And then we do a girls circle group. Once the girls finish there, we will do it for boys, but we don't typically get boys in the groups like that. So if we get males to do that, then we'll do it individually, in just individual treatment. But this is where the girls come together after they finish their individual treatment, and then sometimes it's very healing for them to be with other girls who've had similar experiences, and that they can talk and support each other. And then we also do a non-offending caregivers group, because we know, and that's a support group for adult caregivers of sexually abused kids, because we do know that the number one thing, the number one factor that we know helps a child get a better outcome with their treatment is if they have that caregiver who's supportive and believing and nurturing to them, and they're not falling apart. Because if they're seeing mom cry every day, what are they going to do? They're going to take that shame and blame on again. This is my fault, I should never have told, and this is my fault that my mom's this unhappy. But if mom can hold it together for the child, then we can help her in this support group when she's with other adults whose children were sexually abused. So some of the prevention programs that we provide are the Child Abuse School Liaison Program. We're doing it here tomorrow with the District 2 guidance counselors. We go into the schools as well, and in District 4 as well, teaching how to recognize signs of abuse and neglect, how to adhere to the mandated reporting laws, and then how to respond to a child's disclosure. And we already talked about how we want them to respond to a child's disclosure. Just listen and just thank the child for telling, and that you will get them some help, but not acting appalled at what happened to them, not showing a horrific a reaction to it, and not saying I'm going to make sure they go to jail, because remember, this is most of the time somebody the child knows, loves, and trusts. They don't want them to go to jail necessarily. What they want them to do is just stop doing what they're doing. And then also adhering to the mandated reporting laws, because you may have to go through your hierarchy of your employer as far as the food chain goes, but until you disclose, or excuse me, until you report to law enforcement or Child Protective Services, you have not fulfilled your legal obligation to mandated report. So they need to know that. Sexual abuse prevention program we use is the Darkness to Light prevention program, and if you haven't seen that, we're facilitators for that program, and if you haven't seen that program or been through that program, you need to, because it is our job as adults to protect kids from sexual abuse. And most of it is just common sense, but there have been many kids who were abused that had good parents. They were just too trusting with other adults. And so an example would be if your child was getting ready to go to camp, summer camp, then you go to the camp and you say, okay, is there ever a time when my child's alone with an adult? And if they say, well, yeah, we're doing this tutoring and we go through that door and we're in that room right there and we just need peace and quiet, so the child can concentrate. And your response should always be, well, I'm not putting my child in this camp, because you should have better safety guards than that. Maybe there should be a big mirror there that's a two-way mirror that everybody can see in, and there's a lot of traffic going by, and then structure as to where everybody sits and all of that good stuff. Because if you don't, then 9 times out of 10, I'm sure the people working for you are fine, but it's like playing Russian roulette with my child's life, and I'm not willing to do that. Because once that bell is rung, you cannot unring it at all. You can treat it, we can provide coping mechanisms for them, we can help them get on with their lives, and we can do it in a very positive way, but you can't take it back, and they're always going to have it with them, always. So we can prevent that, and you can prevent it, and that program teaches you how to prevent it. And then we do these community awareness presentations once a month in the center, and we'll do it more. We've done 4 in a month before. But if we have groups that want to come in, and we just bring the community at large in once a month to talk about the things that I've just talked about, to bring awareness that child abuse does exist, how to protect your own children and your own families, and then just, if you ever serve on a jury, that you have more knowledge than the normal juror would have in child abuse cases. This is a program that we're getting ready to do. I just hired somebody who's trained in this, and there's another training we're getting ready to do through the Medical University as well, but a CPT is cognitive processing therapy. And this is done, I think was developed and done for the VA or by the VA, I'm not sure, but it's for post-traumatic stress disorder. We get so many adults in here as caregivers of the kids who are sexually abused that have their own sexual abuse traumas, histories. And you'd think that would not be the case. You'd think that if a mom was sexually abused, that they would make sure that their child never got in a position to be sexually abused. But that doesn't mean this is a bad mom. What it means is this mom is avoiding her own trauma history because she's never dealt with it before. And that means that avoidance is causing her to not make as good decisions as she could make for her child, simply because she's thinking, well, that won't happen to my child because I'm a good mom, or that won't happen to them. It happened to me, but it was my fault that it happened to me. So that's not going to happen. So if they don't get the proper treatment, then a lot of times they're not going to have that good decision making with their own children. And many parents do have that untreated trauma history. So what we want to do is be able to, if we've got the child in here and we find out mom has a trauma history, then we want to treat her as well. She gets a little bit with the TFCBT, but not near enough. She just gets those coping mechanisms and to try to help the child with their own coping, but she doesn't get the in-depth that she needs, and we're going to try to do that, hopefully by the end of the year. But right now we're just trying to keep up with the demand that we have. So the bottom line is, when the children and families come in here, they get the education, the child abuse dynamics, they get all the forensic services that we provide with the medical and the forensic interviews, they get the treatment, evidence-based treatment always, crisis management, the advocacy for the child and the family. We're always looking to see what barriers they have to treatment or anything they need, and if we can't do it or we don't do, because we certainly don't do everything, then there are other good agencies that do provide those things, and we'll hook them up with that. So we have victims advocates. We have 2 victims advocates that work with these families, and they divide them up, and then they're constantly looking at what these kids and these families need to make sure they're getting what they need. And then hopefully what we're going to see is a decrease in those trauma symptoms with the TFCBT, decrease in recidivism rates for the sexual behavior problems, and then we're going to see an increase in the caregiver's ability to not only protect their children, but to parent their children in a more positive fashion. So we're going to be teaching a lot of that. And all of that's going to enhance the family stability, and it's going to enhance educational outcomes for the kids. They're going to be able to concentrate on what they should concentrate on as kids and not being worried about what's going to happen to them when they go home at night. Thank you so much, and thank you for coming. We really do appreciate it, and thank you for the leadership, Dorchester. It's a great program. Thank you. So much.